Good afternoon. Thank you so much for taking time to spend with us today. I'm Eboni Zamani-Gallaher in the School of Education at the University of Pittsburgh, where I serve as Associate Dean for Equity, Justice, and Strategic Partnerships and a professor in higher education. I'd like to thank you again for your time today as we have two wonderful, amazing guests with us today. We're going to dig right in. We're going to have some really good conversations, and we're going to talk about what has been kind of a perennial chilling effects that we are witnessing on our campuses and across the country with respect to anti-LGBTQ and particularly anti-trans bills and behaviors. But before we dig in, let me first make a land acknowledgement. I'd like to share that we recognize that the University of Pittsburgh occupies the ancestral land of the Adena culture, Hopewell, and Zamani-Gallaher, who later joined by refugees of other tribes, were driven from their homelands and by colonizers. And we honor the inhabitants of this place. We uplift their historic, unique, and enduring relationship with this land and their ancestral territory. We pay our respects to their elders and their past, present, and future people, community, and culture. And while we cannot change the past, we commit to continued gratitude for the gifts of nature, along with ongoing respect, care, and stewardship of the land and of each other and for future generations. And with that, I'd love to again warmly welcome close friends, colleagues, and scholars extraordinaire, Drs. Z. Nicolazzo and D.L. Stewart, whom I'd like to invite to again share some pearls of wisdom, give us call to action. But go ahead and, if you will, starting with Dr. Nicolazzo, share a little bit about yourself, introduce yourself, and then we'll hear from Dr. Stewart, and then we'll have some conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Zamani-Gallaher, so much. I'm Dr. Z. Nicolazzo. I live and work in southern Tucson and what's currently known as, Tucson, Arizona. So southern Arizona in Tucson. It's a little early for me still, so I'm still working on my caffeine intake, so apologies for the misspeak, but glad to be here. As you were introducing us, Dr. Zamani-Gallaher, I was thinking about both you and Dr. Stewart being two people that I just don't say no to because I enjoy working with you so much, and I'm glad to be in your company. So excited to be here today, and I think I'll pass it over to Dr. Stewart, who I think is also gonna get us kicked off with some introductory remarks, and then I'll follow up.
All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good day, depending on where you are zooming in and joining us from. I am D.L. Stewart, living and working as a displaced settler on the lands of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute nations and peoples here in what is now known as Denver in the state of Colorado, where I work as a professor and chair of the Department of Higher Education in the Morgridge College of Education at the University of Denver. That's a mouthful, I realize. This area, I think it's important to acknowledge that this area is home to many Indigenous peoples who have been stewards and ongoing past, present, and future stewards of this land. And our institutions, none of our institutions would exist without the violence of settler colonialism exerted on Indigenous peoples, and without actually also the labor of African American, and others on these lands that help build these institutions and the structures and the systems in which they function. And so with that, I think Dr. Nicolazzo and I sort of agree. I would sort of launch in and do my little bit first, and then I would hand over to her to close us out and sort of drop the mics before we open it up here. So with that prelude, I think, I have 3 points. I was raised in religious faith traditions where ministers had 3 points in a poem or 3 points in a song. I won't bring a poem or a song before you this morning, but I do have an A, B, and a C. So my A is that it's important to recognize that these anti-trans movements are intimately connected to the anti-Black movements that we're also seeing at this time that are erupting in the guise of anti-critical race theory, anti-diversity, anti-diversity initiatives in colleges and universities, that these two movements, and I call them movements because they are coordinated and strategic in their form and function. They're not idiosyncratic, they're not just popping up in all these different places, but they are coordinated and strategic movements. That these movements are intertwined, right, through the container of whiteness. And if you'll refer, some of you may be familiar with an article in Equity, Excellence, and Education that Dr. Nicolazzo and I authored, I think it was 2018, in which we argued that the whiteness is a container, really, that holds and perpetuates and furthers normativity across a range of social identities and systems and institutional systems and structures. So that's A, that we need to understand, that anti-Black and anti-trans movements that we are seeing right now are intertwined. They're not separate from each other the way I believe those that are perpetuating these attacks would have us believe. Point B, diversity and inclusion can be used as the rationale through which, right? Because these attacks are saying, well, proclaiming that our institutions are not diverse enough, that they are not inclusive of certain viewpoints, right? And so they're using this rhetoric of diversity and inclusion to justify the attacks that they are making. And they're able to do and use that rationale because these terms are quite honestly vacuous. And they've been co-opted to present what has always and continues to be the dominant norm as that which is shut down, silenced, and oppressed. So they would have us believe that all of a sudden the script has been flipped, all right? Whereas these folks that still have power, right, are now suddenly the ones that are without power, which we know if we have an understanding, systemic and structural understanding of violence, and as it operates within institutions, we know it's not true. We know it's a grand lie, okay? And so because of that, because of the A and the B, we get to the C, right? Which is that resistance and refusal, right? And so I never want to sort of conclude on just this is how things are, this is the damage, but also point to where do we go? How do we get out of this damaged state? And so resistance and refusal must, in my notes, I have that underlined, must engage an intersectional ethic that's grounded in solidarity, both within and across those who are made vulnerable, right? We cannot buy into the fiction that these are separate and idiosyncratic attacks, as I said earlier, or that these groups are separate, right? Because that's also not the case, right? And I'll conclude with a coda here that the attacks are not against wokeness, which is the language that is often being used. These attacks are not against wokeness, but rather that we dare to insist that justice is not only necessary, but that it is possible. These attacks are against the daring to imagine, as to use a Sean Crawley's language, and otherwise, right? That there can be a different way of relating to each other, to ourselves, and to the world around us. And so on that, I am going to turn it over to Dr. Nicolazzo to bring it home here as we wrap this introduction.
Yeah, again, what a gift to be here and to be able to keep on thinking and talking with you, Dr. Stewart. You know, as we were kind of building out some notes for this morning, we decided that we would do something that we often do, which is kind of make multiple different references to various different pieces as a way to kind of track a genealogy of thought. So much of what Dr. Stewart and I are sharing is not only not new in the sense that this has been a decades-long push, largely conservative, neoconservative push to get us to this particular moment, but it's also not just us that are creating these words. And so from time to time, we'll drop some things into the chat. So for example, the otherwise movements piece that Dr. Stewart just mentioned, I dropped into the chat for folks, and we'll be sharing some different texts and books and things like that that either you can go back and revisit if you already have, or visit for the first time to kind of think about the broader kind of group of scholars and scholarship that's creating this movement that we're kind of talking about. You know, in kind of introducing my remarks, I just want to kind of go back to where we started from, which is land acknowledgements and acknowledgements of living in the wake of chattel slavery, right? The ongoing investments in anti-Black racism that both kind of creates the bedrock of this project of the university and this thing that we call education. And I want to name those not just out of some sort of performative desire to virtue signal goodness, right? Which is not what the three of us are doing here in this session, but really to think about how anti-Blackness and Indigenous genocide are root causes of what we're seeing here, right? Specifically when we think about anti-LGBTQ, anti-trans, and what Dr. Stewart and I have really been talking about is anti-trans girl and anti-trans woman legislation and bills, right? It's not to say that just trans women and girls are hurt and harmed by what's happening, but it is to say that trans girls and trans women, and particularly trans girls, are really the focal point of a lot of this vitriol and a lot of this political political violence that's being stoked and created, right? So you know, I think it's always time to name, right, what's happening in terms of whose land we're on. So I'm zooming in from Tohono O'odham Nation, which is the lands of the Tohono O'odham and Pasquayaqui tribes, but also to think about how Indigenous genocide, anti-Black racism are intersecting to create, right, the foundation of this movement of violence that continues to ensnare various different peoples and populations. Where Dr. Stewart left off, I would like to pick up a little bit, and I would like to start with talking a little bit about this idea of freedom dreaming. And specifically, I want to bring us into the world of Tourmaline, Black trans filmmaker, activist, archivist, who wrote this beautiful piece for Vogue magazine, if folks haven't seen it. And in this piece, she writes, and I'm gonna quote a paragraph here, and she says, "Freedom dreaming starts with asking questions, often the same questions over and over, allowing ourselves to get deeper each time. Coming out of the long tradition of freedom schools, I focus on these three questions as an organizer. What does the dominant culture have that we want? What does the dominant culture have that we don't want? And what do we have that we want to keep?" Right? What does the dominant culture have that we don't want? What does the dominant culture have that we do want? And what do we have that we want to keep? I think those are three really important questions to kind of think about what it might mean to desire liberation, desire queer and trans joy, and really think about moving towards otherwises, elsewheres, henceforths, right? If we think about kind of how Indigenous and Black studies and Indigenous and Black thought bring us into not just thinking about what we're given, but what we want and where we want to be, right? So when and this is kind of an incomplete list, right? But when I think about what does the dominant culture have that we want? I think that there are some resources that the dominant culture has that we probably want. Financial, spatial, temporal, right? We can think about various different resources. I think especially when we think about being in and a part of this project of the university and higher education, there are resources, rooms, space, right? That this room that we've created, the space that we're taking is a part of the resources that we have that we probably want, right? There are also what I call some small p protections that some of us have, and some of us have to differential effects, right? So as tenured faculty, we in this room might have, speakers in this room might have some different sorts of protections, but also those protections are always asymmetrical, are always temporally based, and are never kind of, just the same across the board, right? So my being a tenured faculty member, my being a white tenured faculty member affords me various different levels of privileges. Being a trans woman, tenured faculty member, a little tricky, especially in a state of Arizona and at an institution that really doesn't provide trans affirming healthcare, right? So trans people, trans faculty on my particular campus are largely paying for things out of their own pocket when it comes to trans affirming healthcare. There's a little caveat to that. Happy to talk about it in Q&A, but it's not necessarily important for right now. Other things that dominant culture has that we might want is technology. Again, think about this Zoom room, think about online platforms, think about different ways that we can connect and have connected over time. I mean, message boards were by and large places where trans communities would hang out and learn about things that we needed for decades, right? So again, some things that the dominant culture has that we want, some things that the dominant culture has that we don't want. We probably know a lot of this, right? Competitiveness, hyper-individualism, racialized capitalism and differential outcomes determined through systemic oppression, an embedded culture of fear and mis and distrust. I think especially when we think about being a part of the project of education, I often think that I don't want to be a part of the ongoing press to scale up and do more with less and less and less and less. And we also, quite frankly, don't want the unending waves of harm and performative reactive forms of institutional response, right? There are over 450 anti-LGBTQ bills that are being moved through various different state legislatures that the ACLU is tracking right now. I do not want that part of the dominant culture. And I think many of us in this space probably would agree with that, right? In terms of what we as queer and trans people have that I think I would like to keep are abilities to create the worlds that we want and need rather than deal with the world that we're currently given and that we have, right? So when I think about how we do that as queer and trans populations, I think about histories of DIY, community care, and grassroots organizing for love and support, right? So I think about in New York City, where Dr. Stewart is from, the ongoing legacy of the Star House, right, which was created by trans women of color. It was kind of a for us, by us organized kind of group of a house that Sylvia Rivera, Marsha P. Johnson co-founded as a part of Star, and they would give what they could, when they could, where they could, right, for other trans women and queer populations, right? I think about how we've learned how to do hormone sharing across the decades. I think about how we've created zines. I think about how we've created reading lists and consciousness raising groups, right? Thinking about various different movements that we've intersected with and been a part of. I think about how we've done bake sales to be able to create capital, to be able to gain what we need, right? I think about have a student in one of the classes that I'm teaching right now on activism in higher ed who not so jokingly joked that, grad school is just grad students sending the same $10 to each other in Venmo, depending on what time of the semester it is and who needs what. Queer and trans communities have been doing that DIY sort of stuff for a long time, right? So I would like to keep that sort of energy. I would like to keep the idea of interconnectedness and the belief, as Adrienne Marie Brown says in the note in her book, Emergent Strategy, that small is all, right? I'm not necessarily opposed to scaling up, but I'm not invested in scaling up as the first place that we should start with projects, right? I want to think about, what can I do within my sphere of influence, within my community? How can I take care of other people who are then also taking care of me if and when I need, right? So thinking about that idea of interconnectedness, that small is all, I would like to hold on to that in terms of proliferating queer joy and creating underworlds, right? This idea that Gossett and Huxtable talk about in edited anthology called Trapdoor, of creating queer worlds of pleasure and desire underneath this kind of cis heteronormative world that actually has created quite a violent structure through which we have to live, right? When I think about what we have that I would like to keep, I think about Black liberation movements and think about Savannah Shangai's book, Progressive Dystopia, in which she writes about having an abiding belief that we will win, right? I would like to continue to think that we will win and have that abiding belief. And I also want to think alongside fellow Pitt faculty member and administrator Lee Patel, and thinking that that study and struggle go hand in hand, right? I want to think about how we continue to study and how we continue to struggle together, right? That's an important investment in queer and trans futures and otherwise worlds, and in creating the worlds that we want and that we need, right? One other thing, maybe two other things that I might mention is I also want to keep and hold on to the notion of mutual aid. Dean Spade has written a beautiful, very easily accessible book called Mutual Aid that I would encourage people to take a peek at. It has lots of bulleted lists about things that we can do, including things like making music together, sharing food together, and I might end with this idea of noticing livingness, right? So I think it's important to recognize, and I think various scholars and probably Dr. Stewart would agree with me, it's important to recognize the field that we're on, right? And what's going on around us, right? It's important to note the violence and the violent effects that this legislation and these movements, as Dr. Stewart rightly called them, are having, right? And also, as Tiffany Lethabo King mentions in The Black Shoals, and Catherine McKittrick mentions in her latest book, Dear Science and Other People or Other Stories, it's really important to notice livingness, right? It's important to notice how queer and trans people are living joyfully, how we're wanting to want, right? It's important to think about how queer and trans people are desiring more from gender and sexuality than other people might be able to bear, right? And that is something that I want us to continue to move toward and not away from, right? We shouldn't be scared to want, or we shouldn't be scared of our want, but we should look to create worlds through which we can tumble into our desire and continue to want and want more, because that's how we're going to make the worlds that we need, right? While also seeking redress and seeking very much course correction on the world that we're given, right? So just some ideas, maybe some things that we can start to spur our thinking based on these three animating questions that Tourmaline invites us to think about, and that you folks can take those questions with you after the session to keep on working them through, both within your offices, your departments, and or just your worlds, right? The people that you're connected to in your worlds, however you would define or think about your family, right? So with that, I think I'll pass it over. I know Dr. Zamani-Gallaher, you might have some questions for us. So yeah.
Thank you both so much. One of the things I guess I'll start with is, we recently on our campus, as I shared with you, have had a string of speakers that have been on campus that, again, there's been some challenging and harmful rhetoric. And I think it's essential that we challenge such harmful rhetoric and misinformation about transgender folk, and how even in lieu of trying to recognize free speech, how misinformation, harmful rhetoric contributes to discrimination, perpetuates prejudice. And so could you speak to what can we do in terms of countering anti-trans rights and backlash in speech? Because it appears that there's backlash, if you will, as well as a way in which legal protections, support, advocacy are not being recognized, but being, stripped away. And as we want to have a more inclusive and equitable campus as well as society, if you might share with our audience some of your thoughts about how we support trans and queer folk, how we challenge harmful rhetoric, and how do we shore up protections of rights.
You want to go first, or should I, Dr. Stewart? Okay. Yeah, it's a really good question, Dr. Zamani-Gallaher, and I appreciate you bringing this up. So I'm going to share a policy brief that both myself and Dr. Stewart helped co-author along with various other folks gosh, time is such a weird thing. When did we do this deal? Did we do this last semester? So, and there are other authors in this room. So Dr. Alex C. Lang, Dr. Harper B. Keenan, Dr. Jules Gill Peterson, Dr. Kevin Kumashira, and Lil Miss Hot Mess, who is a colleague of mine here at the University of Arizona. So anyway, here's the document that we wrote, the policy brief that we wrote. I think it's important to share this because as we identify in this document, some of the organizations that are pushing this particular narrative and this particular anti-queer and trans rhetoric that you mentioned have actually been identified as extremist anti-LGBTQ hate groups by the Southern Poverty Law Center. These are groups that also have been invested in opposing divestment from apartheid in South Africa. And so again, we can see the intertwining of violent rhetoric and movements across literally decades of time. In terms of thinking about what we can do, again, if we go back to this idea of small as all, there are some what I might call in-house things that we can do, right? How do we take care of our own and create space and time with and for queer and trans people? How do we cultivate joy? How do we think about making sure that basic needs are met? Like, do you have a place to sleep? Do you have food? As well as thinking about how do we create space to learn our own history, which often curricula won't teach us through K through 12 education and is forcibly removed from K through 12 curriculum in many senses. How can we learn about what rights we have to be able to counteract and move through this world in particular ways? So I was a part of, with Harper Keenan and Nora, an activist who's working through K through 12 organizations, actually co-founded a K through 12 organization called Texas Trans Futures in Texas. We created a trans freedom summer school last summer, which had a Know Your Rights session, which can be really important. So yeah, I think some of those are important strategies, and also to never lose sight of the livingness aspect of it, right? And noticing livingness can be really powerful. I also think it's really important for non-queer and non-trans people, especially people with access and with the ability to get and hold on to resources, to really think about how they use their time and their space to, redirect and redistribute resources towards queer and trans futures, as well as do some of the heavy lifting that oftentimes is incredibly exhausting for queer and trans populations, because we continue to be fighting this for, it seems like every minute that we wake up, we're trying to fight for an existence. So I really think it behooves non-queer and non-trans people to step up and to take the lead and to take note from what queer and trans populations have been doing for decades. I don't know, I'm babbling. So DL, I don't know if you have more.
So thank you. I think what's at the root of what excuse me, I cannot talk this morning, but Dr. Nicolazzo has just shared are how do we create systems and networks that don't rely on really the institution, right? And that really engage sort of in a subterfuge, right? Within institutions. So as I think about drawing from several different folks here whose links I'm going to drop in the chat. And I talked earlier about the necessity of solidarity and having an intersectional ethic, recognizing that groups have not only within our own groups, so I speak as someone who is both Black and trans, okay, that we are not the only ones who have been doing this work, as Dr. Nicolazzo has expressed already. We also have folks who have been doing and engaging in this work and developing these strategies for decades and centuries. So as I think about our Indigenous siblings, right, who have engaged in this work. I'm thinking particularly, and this came up, I give full credit to the brilliant dissertation proposal that I just read over the weekend by Charlie Scott here at the University of Denver, who cites and uses safety zone theory. So Loma Waima and McCarty, there's a special issue of the Journal of American Indian Education in which they talk about safety zone theory and the ways that within these institutions of violence that are built and reliant on the ongoing settler colonialism and anti-indigeneity, that Indigenous peoples and Indigenous students, faculty, staff come together and create zones of safety which can support Indigenous sovereignty, right, within these institutions, which connects also, I think, to LaPaperson's work, A Third University is Possible, the University of Minnesota Press, a short but very theoretically dense text, but within this, one of the pieces that I can lift out is the ways, and LaPaperson uses the language of cyborgs that some have critiqued as well, but I think the point is that within the machinations of the institution, there have always been sources and places of resistance and refusal, okay? Within it, that creates sort of within the first university and the second university is a third university that is not reliant on the systems and structures of dominant normative institutional processes. And this idea of resistance and refusal, particularly also as I look to Indigenous scholars, Sandy Grant and Andra Simpson, have also talked about a politic of refusal, if I might call it that, right? And so how do we situate ourselves in these spaces, refusing these spaces as we use them for their resources, right? As Dr. Nicolazzo talked about before and drawing on the questions from Tourmaline, what does the dominant culture have that we want, right? And as she said, we want their resources, right? So how do we, within these institutional spaces, engage in acts of resistance and acts of subterfuge, as I mentioned earlier, to create zones of, to borrow again from Indigenous scholars, to create zones of safety, okay, for ourselves that don't rely on the institution. Now, I do want to say something toward the institution, okay, and about the role of these institutions in perpetuating harm, Okay. I've written about the need that institutions, as supposedly being spaces supporting critical thinking skills, need to actually support critical thinking in the programming and the speakers and events that they allow to have happen on their campuses, right? How do we shape and create spaces that actually promote critical thinking? And yes, often the response from institutions is, well, students, or sometimes the response is, well, students, particularly if they talk at minoritized students, can do their own speech acts in resistance, right? Which puts labor on those students in order to do that. And at the same time, as institutions say, well, students can use their own, can offer their own speech acts in resistance, they push them off campus to some other place where they should do that. Or, which has just happened in the winter quarter here at the University of Denver, pushing them to other spaces where, and then also shutting down speech. Okay, and that resistance. Liliana Garces, who's a scholar in higher ed studies, has coined a construct called repressive legalism, right? And the article is actually by multiple authors. Liliana is the lead author on that, so I don't want to enter. There we go. I don't want to misrepresent that it's a co-authored effort in the American Educational Research Journal, where basically she's talking about institutional cowardice, okay? And how it undermines really the claims toward inclusion. Okay, even if we were to use that vacuous language, institutions are undermining that through this repressive legalism, this cowardice that says, well, we can't do anything about it, right? Which is not true. Okay. And LaWanda Ward also in her writing about the ways that the First Amendment has been twisted and misused by institutions, right? So there is institutional responsibility here. But I do not want to rely on institutions to be responsible. Okay. Institutions are inherently irresponsible as systems and structures of dominance. Okay. So while we can call out the irresponsibility, we also have to be working at the same time to create our own structures of accountability, of mutual aid, as Dr. Nicolazzo talked about earlier, that refute systems of harm and violence.
Yeah,
So I'll stop there.
Yeah, and you know, Dr. Stewart, as you're talking, I'm thinking about someone else who's in the webinar with us right now, Dr. Chase Catalano, who always pushes me to and reminds me to think beyond either or constructs, right? So it's not either we change the institution and it gets better, or we forsake the institution because it's terrible. It's both we hold the institution accountable and responsible for its actions, and also seek to create worlds that we need both on and off campus, right? So moving from an either or to a both and also mentality, I think can be really powerful and important. And one of the other things that I might offer to Dr. ZG to your question is that I think we need to hold ourselves, and I mean myself, the three of us, everyone else in this room, I think that we need to constantly be doing some questioning as to whom we're answerable when it comes to this work that we're doing, right? Again, drawing from Indigenous Studies scholarship and Mohawk Interrupt Us, right? Simpson's work, Mohawk Interrupt Us, where there's a conversation about answerability. And by that, I mean, am I just doing what Martin and Harney talk about as critical education par excellence? Am I saying the right words? Am I critiquing in the right sorts of ways? Am I getting the right invites to do talks at various different places? Or, and here's the piece that I'm mentioning about the university and the Undercommons, Or am I actually thinking about, to whom am I answerable? Am I moving and acting in a way that's in alignment with my espoused values? And can I go home to my communities doing what I'm doing, right? I think that that behooves all of us who do equity-based work, right, writ large, to really think about for whom and to whom are we doing this work, and how are we seeing all of our liberation bound up together, right? And that's some self-work that we all need to do regularly, right?
For sure, indeed. And as I'm, digesting as you all are talking and thinking again about encountering what is anti-trans and queer activities, and particularly the assault on rights, right? Everything you're just saying is, again, just reiterating that this requires a multi-tiered and multifaceted approach, right? So it's not just about, we got to educate folks, because there are some folks that are definitely uneducated and ignorant as to what is happening, right? The fact that we have 480 some odd anti-trans bills introduced just this year. The fact that we have on our campuses half of all Black trans students routinely saying they're facing harassment. The fact that, about a third of LGBTQIA students, that are enrolled at places like, our campuses, at these four-year campuses, are, again, commonly bullied, harassed, if not assaulted. And we look at the data that campuses are reporting to the Department of Education relative to bias incidents and hate crime reporting, right? And we see that all of that is parallel to what's happening, right, in the larger society. Kind of almost mundane nature with which folk are misgendered, right? That all too well. We talked about earlier today when we said, how do you advocate, how do you support? And you mentioned some basic needs pieces, right? And so, again, some of what we have to recognize in terms of, and I'm thinking about with Joy Gaston Gale's presidency and the theme of the Association for the Study of Higher Ed conference, this most immediate past one, of humanizing, right, higher education and the recognition of human rights of transgender folk, and the work that we still need to do and haven't done. And the fact that, again, I think DL, you talked about this play, and kind of, almost head fake of what folks are trying to do as they restrict access to or, which restroom you go into, or, what's your gender expression, or how you should, talk about your gender identity, that there's ways in which all of those challenges are coming on the heels of a so-called DEI agenda, right? And so that DEI is under attack, we know, in many states. And Z, you mentioned that there is ways in which folks are conflating this, but they're also converging in terms of how we have to call for some counter programming, if you will, in terms of the panels and the discussions, the speakers that are coming to our campuses that are not combating transphobic attitudes, but are, exacerbating them in many regards. So I'm wondering if we could spend a little time engaged in some dialogue and then maybe take some questions as well from our attendees. But as we think about, and you mentioned Charlie's work, DL, how do we do the counter program, and how do we create the safe zones and talk about and interrogate what does it mean to have a safe space? What does it mean to be inclusive? And, what does it mean, especially when you talked about institutional responsibility, DL, and I, was trying to hold it together because I was thinking, at what point in time has it not been that we have to have so-called diversity police? Because American institutions just don't voluntarily seek to be inclusive or diverse, or to promote understanding, right? And so all of this opposition to DEI initiatives, essentially too, is heightening what is unfairness and inequity in our educational environment across the board, right? In terms of a diverse array and a multiplicity of cells and folk. So can we kind of talk about, you know, what we have, I guess, in the way of what are our demands, right? We want to overcome oppression. We want to create, I know the three of us at least are on the same page about how do you create more inclusive and welcoming environments? How do you engage in these productive conversations? And how do you do this in a way, particularly in a climate where what seems to be more commonplace than not is a DEI argument that suggests that inclusion, diversity, equity is discriminatory against certain groups, i.e. white people and men, and straight folk and folk that are Christian. And, you know, so help us to kind of problematize, situate, you know, how can we still be about prioritizing safety and well-being, promoting dialogue and understanding when we have such well, I won't even call it retrenchment. It's just a full-on attack, right?
Yeah, I might maybe start with some, again, going back to Adrienne Marie Brown's work, I might start with some small as all stuff, and then DL, you know, you're reticent to talk about how great you are, Dr. Stewart. So I might invite you to talk about your Inside Higher Ed piece, because I think that there's some institutional language that could be really helpful here in thinking about institutional and broader systems redress. And I know that that's a large part of what you've been doing, especially recently with some policy work. So all to say, if we go back to Tourmaline's piece, right, that kind of started off some of my comments, she has some other really important things that I think are really meaningful, right? She talks about, you know, when I dye my hair blue at home in my bathtub, reclaiming the color from its capture by racist police, I'm freedom dreaming. When I take a walk down my block and slow down to touch and smell the blooming flowers bursting with vitality, I'm freedom dreaming. When I Venmo my friend $25 with a heart emoji so that they can safely take a cab home from a protest or a date or a doctor's appointment, I'm freedom dreaming. I think there are ways that we can freedom dream by ourselves and in small communities, right? So I also see Danny Lucchese's question in the Q&A, and hi, Danny. Danny's one of the students that I'm learning alongside of this semester. I had the joy of learning alongside Danny. And one of the things that Danny is also asking about is how do we create safe spaces and practices? We think about the spaces that we're in and we imbue them with queer and trans love and desire, right? Like, what does it mean to create a classroom environment where we can share food and be together with each other? What does it mean for us to think about making sure that each other is safe getting home, right? What does it mean to think about doing some of this small as all work and also reckoning with with our own ingesting of anti-trans rhetorics, right? Because I constantly am needing to unlearn some of this stuff because I'm just saturated in it, right? Because I am also in this society that those can be things that we need to contend with and continue to practice. And I use this idea of practice very strategically because it's an ongoing practice, it's an iterative process, and that by doing this individually and with each other in small communities, we can then build up to, right, feeling like we can address some of the broader stuff and also remember and mark our own livingness and our own joy, right? So when I take a walk with my dog in the morning and I say, this is my time with my dog, I'm going to enjoy the outside, that's a practice of freedom dreaming, right? And can then be something that either gives us energy to face some of the bigger things, and also take stock in the fact that there is joy and livingness in our world. So I don't know, Dr. Stewart, if you have some thoughts about the institutionalness of this all.
Certainly. And I'm actually going to point folks beyond the Inside Higher Ed essay, which, you know, is cool and all, but I wrote beyond that, and elaborated on it actually. And I please painfully note that this was written as well as the Inside Higher Ed piece under my dead name. So please do not dead name me and continue that practice when you reference this. But this chapter is actually in a Teachers College yearbook, or Teachers College record issue that was co-edited by our host, Dr. Eboni Zamani-Gallaher, and as well as Dr. AJ Welton, where, like I said, I go beyond what's in the Inside Higher Ed piece. I will kind of start there because these ideas are also encapsulated within this chapter, where, you know, as I said before, the reason why DEI initiatives are both under attack and are used as the rationale for the attacks is because diversity and inclusion as constructs are inadequate. Okay. They ask different kinds of questions than an equity or justice framework would ask. And when you ask different questions, you get different answers. Okay. So if we think about the speakers on campus, okay, we might, you know, ask, and I think institutions are often talking about when they bemoan viewpoint diversity, the claim that there's an absence of viewpoint diversity on their campuses. They're coming from this diversity and inclusion lens that is asking, well, has everyone's ideas been heard? And the claim that everyone's ideas are not being heard. Where the kinds of questions they need to be asking is whose ideas will be taken as seriously because they aren't in the majority, right? And so this refuting that these ideas, these attacks that are rooted in neoliberalism, that are rooted in whiteness, are in the minority, okay, and that they are minoritized, right? It's just simply not the case, because if they were, institutions would look radically different than they do. Okay. These institutions are also more asking questions about, well, isn't it separatist, right, to provide funding for safe spaces and separate student centers, right, like ethnic and cultural centers and other ethnic studies spaces, when we think about disciplinarily and academically, where the question they need to be asking are, what are people experiencing on campus that they don't feel safe when they're isolated and separated from others like themselves? What's happening where people don't feel safe? Why is it? And Dr. Nicolazzo, in company with others, has also made this argument that if this is the safe space, what does that mean about the rest of campus? Okay. And what does it mean about the fact that we're apparently comfortable with the fact that the rest of campus is unsafe? All right. So, you know, those are a couple of questions. I want to lift up one more thing before we go into the questions in the chat, that as I think about institutional leadership, that I think is important. And there's one here, it's the 8th one in this list of, I think, 10. Communicating the vision for transformational change, as well as the short and long-term strategic actions necessary to achieve it. What's your vision? Who do you want to be as an institution? Are you willing to stake a claim to be something, to be known for something other than to be known for nothing? Okay. And I think institutions and institutional leaders, presidents, chancellors, boards of trustees are unwilling and perhaps unable to actually communicate such a vision for transformational change.
Thank you so much. We do have a few minutes left, and with our time that we have, there's a few questions that are in the chat from attendees. The first of which is, Danny, for those of us under the trans umbrella in higher education, what are some identifying factors in a trans-friendly school? And how can we find and create community in these places when it's not obvious? So if either of you.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think one of the first things that I would encourage us to do is to recognize that the Campus Pride Index might not be the best thing to look at, right? A school can have 4.5 out of 5 stars, but it might not be trans friendly. It just means that there are some administrators who have created some policies that are symbolically important, but might not actually do the doing of trans liberation. See comments that I made in my first book, Trans in College, about kind of the Campus Pride Index. So what I think might be important is to think about how you as a trans person, Danny, and other trans people feel, right? I think feelings are really important. What is it? How do you feel on that campus, right? And again, think about how you can continue to create community in ways that you have and that we have for decades and generations, right? We can largely think also off campus, right? So in my first book, Trans in College, there are multiple participants who talked about moving off campus to create spaces and find spaces, both in jobs, creating book clubs, studying abroad, right? There are various different ways that you can think about that. That work also aligns with Dr. TJ Jorian's work, whose participants at one point said, I don't fuck with campus. I see Dr. Alden Jones, one of my co-authors for a new book called Digital Me, in the chat talking about online spaces as well. So, like, again, online is tough, right? We know that racism is literally embedded into code, and also queer and trans communities of color have found digital kinship networks online and created spaces not only to think about how they can be with other people, but envisioning future possible selves, who they can become. So I think that not just focusing on what campus provides, but thinking about how we've always created community in various different ways to undermine just focusing on campus could be helpful. Dr. Stewart, I don't know if you have other thoughts.
I have thoughts about another question in the chat. So I think you've
Right. If you want to go to that question, is it the one that starts with those of us trans staff and students? Would you share that question then? And then
sure. I'll try to summarize the question a little bit. So this person is speaking out of the institutional context at Pitt about the ways that trans staff, students, and faculty have been pressing for institutional support, wanting full-time LGBTQI+ resource staff centers, basic needs funding, arts and academic funding, et cetera. University's not going to fund these projects, but they want to claim DEI credit for the work that students, staff, and contingent faculty are using their own resources to do. And the question asks specifically, how do you suggest we move forward if the pessimism and burnout continues on and these speakers keep coming? I really, there's a couple things in my mind. One, I will say, not tongue in cheek, but the Montgomery bus boycott was not funded by a grant. Okay. The Montgomery bus boycott was not funded by the public transportation system in Montgomery. Okay. It was funded and it was made possible through mutual aid networks. Okay, what we would now call mutual aid networks. That was the that's where it came, and the resistance, the ability to continue to press in and lean in as that went on for a year. Okay, was rooted in the fact in a distributive, even though we constantly look, using the example of this boycott, we constantly look to a single leader and we call out Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King, love him to death, great, awesome. And he was not the leader of the Montgomery bus boycott. He actually was not. Okay. It was a network of leadership, mostly actually engineered by the work of Black women, notably, who made that happen. Okay. And it was a process by which certain people moved forward as other folks moved back, and other folks moved forward as those folks moved back. And what I'm saying is that there needs to be a willingness amongst within our communities to, I think about, I used to run track ages ago, and thinking about handing off the baton. It's a relay race, right? And it can't always be the same folks in the lead. And so how do we recognize when each other are tired and need to fall back and someone else needs to step forward? Mm-hmm. And how are we building capacity for other people to step forward? Okay. While folks who have been on the front lines can fall back and get some rest. Okay. I really do believe, even as we need to hold institutions accountable, we need to also divest in institutions as the answer. Okay. Institutions are not going to be the answer. And we need to divest in the logic that says that institutions can be the answer. They will not be the answer. All right. We need to hold them accountable, as Dr. Nicolazzo said, and also recognize that that's not where our sources and resources of joy are going to come from. We make this place a little less horrible by working within the smaller spaces. The small is all, right? As Dr. Nicolazzo keeps referencing Adrienne Marie Brown, in order to understand and live in what joy is about. Okay. So that I think that's important to hold in mind, right? Our movements for liberation were not funded by the systems and structures that we were fighting against.
Right. Well, I know we're a little bit over time, and really appreciate that the critical mass of folk have stayed on board, because this is, again, an engaging and most important conversation. You're getting all the emojis, hand claps, snaps, and the hearts and cheers, because again, this is a bomb, if you will, for many of us here. And so I do want to acknowledge, we have one other question, and kind of have us close out with it. As a master's student in higher ed, how can we as students make sure that we are holding our programs, ourselves and peers accountable to making loving Black queer spaces?
I'll go ahead and jump in, right? Because I'm, as I mentioned in my introduction, work as a chair of a department, right, of higher education, and are thus implicated, right, again, in the question and in the answer here. There's a two-prong, I think. How are students, both in whether master's programs, doctoral programs, EDD, PhD, whatever, how are students creating their own learning spaces? And I offer this because, I didn't learn about Nikki Giovanni because I pressed my teacher to teach Nikki Giovanni. I learned Nikki Giovanni because I went and learned her on my own. So I had a desire and I went and chased that desire. So how are we supporting each other's desires to learn? At the same time as, we are making it clear in speaking up and out to department chairs, to our faculty, to folks above them, to say this is what we need in the classroom. This is what we need. Okay. And making that both and call, that two-prong, right? Because all the labor should not be on the students. That's not what I'm saying. But we also have to take responsibility for our own learning at the same time. And so it's the same answer we gave in terms of institutions. How do we take responsibility for creating our own spaces at the same time as we make demands of the institutions and structures that we live within? And so when our faculty say, well, we come from a critical framework, but that critical framework is not showing up in the classroom, okay, what are the strategies and techniques that can be used to say, we need you to live up to what you're saying you are about, okay? And to do that in ways that seek partnership and collaboration, and are not rooted in necessarily antagonism. Because, you know, as I think about across the field and many of my colleagues, how do we work together to create these spaces, okay? Instead of just approaching with antagonism around this. How can we work together as accomplices? How can we work together as partners to create these spaces and the invitation in, right? To be able, the invitation to do what we say we're about, right? How do we make invitation? How do we make invitation?
Yeah. Study, struggle, repeat again, right? And I think, you know, Dr. Stewart, that note that you're giving about solidarities and cross-coalitional work is so important. I might also add to, particularly for the white people in the room, to not get sidetracked or held up by moves to innocence, right? So again, think about answerability, right? Am I doing this public statement because I want to be seen as the good white person in the room or the best white person in the room? Or am I doing it because I have a commitment, because I espouse various values, that I'm in community, in loving community with various different people across racial and ethnic identities, across gender and sexualities, and I see my liberation as bound up with theirs, right? So again, I think it's really these moves to innocence are they trip many of us up, right? Especially white folks. And so the more that you can practice, the more that you can study and struggle within communities, various cross-coalitional communities, the more likely you'll be to be able to identify and name those moves to innocence and not get trapped by them, right? Not to say that they ever go away, right? But it's important to be able to name and to move beyond those.
Thank you both. Thank you everyone who in the chat posed questions, all of you for attending. I know we went over, but again, we know that this was a conversation that is much needed and is an elixir in some ways, and again, does give us a call to action, right? For those of us that consider ourselves advocates or allies, really needing to be accomplices. Again, consult with affected communities before inviting speakers to campus. Think about speakers' views and how things can be harmful. Think about how to provide counter programming, such as the space that we tried to create today. Again, interrogate, you know, what does it mean when we say safety? Because that's relative and how we create safe spaces. And again, beyond this convening virtually, we hope that you continue to engage in dialogue and daring dialogues, because it's important to protect the well-being of transgender and queer folk on our campuses, and that it's important to foster understanding and true inclusivity that steps beyond our statements. So with that, I want to say thank you so much to Dr. Nicolazzo. I'm getting tongue-tied too, DL, and Dr. DL Stewart, again, special guests today, who were, just dropping science, pearls of wisdom, and just, again, leaning into all of their dopeness. So I just thank you for your time. And we hope that you will continue to walk the talk and have a good day.